Hanif Kara is founder and design director of Engineers AKT II. He's also professor in practice of architectural technology at Harvard GSD. Now, the NLA's latest exhibition is called Changing Face of London and looks at the capital's growth over the last 15 years or so. And AKT has been involved in many of the projects that have changed the face of London, from Stratford to Nine Elms. So, Hanif, you've also worked around the world. How well do you think London has done in accommodating growth compared to other cities that you know?
Thank you, Peter and NLA, first of all, for having me. I think that question, I thought about it a bit as I've been at home, and I've always wondered what it is we were doing right. I think we have to calibrate the question carefully. So there are two or three things about London that keep it where it is. One is its size. It swallows up, the other cities that I go to in Europe. It would swallow up 5 of them. The other is its 2,000-year history, which I think produces a modernity and a transformation that is very different, say, from the USA, where modernity started 250 years ago when the state started, or if you go to the Far East, where they're raising things to the ground. So that second component of its age. And probably the third thing that I think we need to calibrate it with is the nationalities. We have a diverse population because of our history, 270 nationalities. So to compare it directly is risky. To compare it and cherry pick with the convenient ones is also risky. But my own observation has been that it's been doing extremely well, London. And this latest shock, we need to see what will happen. But it's been, I hate the word resilient at times, but I think it's had the identity and the quality and culture and the people within it to allow us to continue. And I think it will still remain that way. In terms of development, I think that we have found the perfect balance in our construction capacity when we look at things like, say, Crossrail and the tall buildings we've done, where we thought we couldn't do very tall buildings, and we managed to do one. So that balance between the global construction that comes in, that homogenizes most cities by making them look alike, has come in, whereas our construction capacity from the large contractors has balanced that well, so that we've been able to build things that are unique. So I think that all those 3 kind of seeds that I put down would be the reason why I think we are still leading the world. If you compare us to the Chinese cities or the Indian cities, it's very different conversation, because they are being homogenized. It's been accepted that the global forces and the changes are rapid. So you do get sameness. Every district you go to looks the same. It takes 45 minutes to get to a station in some of these places, to do a 30-minute journey. So I do feel strongly that we have done well. We could do better with our infrastructure and our public realm. We could do better with making our streets more friendly, and maybe reduce the homogeneity that is in the retail sector that we have at the moment. That's probably going to begin to happen with places like Oxford Street changing, with White City opening a few years ago. So on the whole, I feel that sometimes people accuse all these cities, and us in particular, of being commodity driven. So our buildings are banks for people to invest in. I don't buy that. I think that the urban planning, the taste judges that are around, the people who protect our city, have been pretty much careful, and they have had no choice because of our history. And we're not necessarily a generic city compared to many of the others. So that would be my kind of takeaway. I think that trajectory hopefully will bring us back out in however long it takes now, into the world, and keep us as leaders. We're seen as leaders, still many places refer to us. And when you look at, whether you look at the architects here or the architects, as I call them, the quality of both productions is pretty high. So I would imagine that we'll still be able to feed construction in this country to become an exemplar for the rest of the world. And I am so pleased that if I wanted to be anywhere at this particular moment in my life, it would be London.
So you mentioned Starchitects, and what were the other ones? Logitechs.
Logitechs means local architects who are sure-footed, you know. So London has a, what I'm trying to say is the difference between the two in some parts of the world is massive. So you might get a huge Norman Foster building and then a lot of rubbish around it. Whereas we have, we have a good balance. And I think that's partly to do with the way our city is protected architecturally and regionally, and also the outer boroughs, how we protect them. So even the local kind of work, that I would call it local, is dealt with very well. Largely speaking, the quality of work is good. I know there's a lot of complaints about house building and the qualities of those places not being as good as they could be, so on and so on. But in terms of your initial question about comparisons, whether it's the global South or North America or Africa, I feel I'm in the right place. Confident about that.
I'm very glad to hear that. So you mentioned tall buildings, and you've been involved in a number of high-rise developments in London, One Park Drive, One Nine Elms, the South Bank Tower. So how do you respond to those who suggest that tall buildings are inherently unsustainable?
Here I can speak both as an engineer and as a human being. I mean, the question is really about density. And those of us who are in the industry, have watched over the 30 or 40 years, people like Ricky Burdett at LSC have done a lot of work on the fact that London isn't as dense as it could be when you compare it. So when you talk about density, it drives you, if you deduce it quickly, to how do you create it? Do you create it in the American way with sprawl, where you go further and further out, or do you create it with a denser, packed city? So I'm a fan of tall buildings. But engineers, all engineers want to do at least one tall building and one bridge before they die. That's our life's ambition. So I'm a fan of those. And I think we have the ones you mentioned, for example, are significantly important as types, because each one of those three, particularly the one, say, with Herzog de Meuron in Canary Wharf, changes the way vertical living is in that case. And it also is in the context of a very successful commercial development, which had most of our tall buildings. So it's again an exemplar. It's not just any tall building. And I think that there is a lot to learn from them. I can understand that the issue of sustainability is now being brought to the front, and they're perceived to be not sustainable, a wrong way to construct, and so on and so on. But the balance is that when you're packed and in a smaller place to travel, and if we can get rid of the car as well, you're actually the density of these places creates more sustainability over the longer term. If you think about it, the embodied energy in a tall building is questionable, and we need to get better at how we build them, how we construct them, how we make them, how we, more than anything else, how we power them. More and more we go towards electricity and an element of natural ventilation, new systems in passive cooling and so on, the better they will get. So on the whole, I'm I sit on the fence sometimes and worry that they're shaped for the sake of shape, but I am a fan of them in London. I think that in many cities that are already developed and built, they actually do wonders. I don't even have an objection with the, let's just call the complete exotic ones that are being built now in New York. For a structural engineer, they're extremely exciting, those really tall buildings. But they do question sustainability much more than the kind of buildings you just mentioned, where there is a guardian in each case who's not only interested in the building, but is interested in attaching himself to the global funds that are coming in, attaching himself to fantastic architects. All of those buildings, KPF, Herzog de Meuron, are all very good architects who know how to do London well. They don't just bring a bit of New York to London. They don't just bring a bit of China to London. And the Shard is a great example of that, Renzo Piano. I think it's so unique. It's amongst the hundreds of fantastic 400-meter tall towers, it's one of the ones that stands out. So I think I'm pretty much for them. I think we can improve a lot on what we do below ground. I think we can improve a lot on the public space and allow people to get to them uh, easier, so you can walk and stay in a district. And I think in your report that I had a look at it the other day in the FT, where you were talking about the fact that there is a turn down, a little bit of a turn down in applications. But you did mention that the outer ring of London or the outer boroughs have got lots of them going up. So tall is also partly to do with relativeness. You know, in some of these areas, like say Ealing or Acton and so on, a 20 or 30-story building is tall, and is a sustainable way to do it. All that we will need to do, I think, is reinforce the streets so that there is life and culture, so that now that we're having this situation where the balance of working from home and working in the city is going to change, that we're able to calibrate this so that people can stay in their district and have a quality of life outside, be on the streets, and be able to use the public, let's call it a private public realm in a better way. That, I think, has got a way to go in the outer boroughs. And that's probably to do with investment and how you knit these things together. So I'm a fan, is my answer, I suppose.
So, and how do you think we'll work in offices as a result of COVID-19? And you worked on Bloomberg, the white collar factory, as well as the new Google offices. These are three significant and innovative projects. So what can we learn from them, and how will they adapt to the sort of changing work patterns in the future?
Well, first of all, I'm fortunate because of London that you have patrons like that wanting to be here. So when the ones you mentioned, you know, it's a Google headquarters, Bloomberg's headquarters, there one Simon Silver's history in doing great buildings. We're also doing Facebook and just finished LinkedIn on Farringdon Lane. So in a way, I think we're fortunate to have the global companies wanting to be here. So what's common about all of these is all of these people worked it out way before us. So I was fortunate in what they baked in. So even before COVID, a lot of these companies, when you look at the Bloomberg headquarters, for example, Foster's office have designed it to breathe in the future when air quality is better. If you look at, say, Google's headquarters, it's quite interesting because when we were pitching for Mountain View and that project, I was fortunate enough to bump into the book, How Google Works, which was written by Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO at the time. And I was trying to work out, you know, not really for my business, but for my understanding, what was this incredible thing about this company? Why would it do buildings? And what was the connection between it and the buildings that they would produce? And when you try to find out their secrets, you find out it's very simple. Their kind of quality of what they wanted to produce was completely based on the nature of the people that they were going to have in there. And they were very specific about it. They never mentioned the buildings when they were briefing us about the original competitions. It was more about the people. So the super source was really, that's our key to us. And it was specific. We want to target creative, talented people wherever we are in the world. So all these people, Bloomberg, you know, White Collar Factory is based on that model. Google's headquarters are based on that model. Is based on a person-centric approach to office design. And that by its nature takes you away from the basics of worrying about prevention of disease. So what they did, right, you know, from the beginning, I think we baked in social health, physical and mental. We baked in social interactions. We baked in many things early on, some of which will benefit as we move into what we hadn't predicted, which is this virus. So my instinct is that the nature of these buildings is such that the patrons were fortunate enough to foresee the design or what they wanted. And then the second thing that happened, I think, which is also to our benefit in those buildings, is that in each case, the architects were selected carefully. And a lot of these architects, when you see it's, Foster and Partners, Bjarke Ingels with Thomas Heatherwick, AHMM architects, when you see them, they were also all quite at the peak of their career, where they were looking to reinvent many types of buildings. So in terms of a typology and workspace, I feel that the way that the patrons were thinkers appointed the architects forced a situation where there was a move away from homogenization. How can we break the rules of basic office work, given that we want people to be the most important thing? And I suspect that that made a big difference, which gives us a more timeless quality about all of these buildings. Bloomberg is, in my opinion, one of the best. It will stay there for 100 years without any question. And White Collar Factory and Google, similar lines. There's a long-term thinking in the way we did it. Specifically, in Google headquarters at King's Cross, we have CLT floors. It's the largest cross-laminated timber floor in the world, right? That's to allow them to adapt it, change it, the space heights and so on, and should they ever want to change the building type. So they were investing and thinking ahead and breaking away from the norms of, even London has some kind of level at which it won't go, because they foresee design as a cost rather than an investment. Whereas these buildings saw design and construction as a massive investment. So I think they will adapt, they will change. We will move away very quickly from the basics that we're actually in White Collar Factory that we're doing right now, where you're doing the normal stuff about social distancing, looking at your ventilation system and see whether we can protect ourselves if the air quality in the long term on the outside gets better. I think we'll move away from those basics, very quickly, and really look at big picture thinking that allows us to quickly change again and again in all of these buildings. And they're built to do that. The clients have invested, in my opinion, enough. And it goes all the way back to what Google have written about in their book. What is it that makes Google? It is finding, attracting wonderful people who are capable of themselves adapting fast in these spaces. And the nature of these creatives is such, and I know this because we occupy 2 floors in White Collar, as I was saying to you. And I know that that's been one of our keys, was to learn from these people, apply some of that chemistry into the White Collar, and then have a diverse young population of creatives from all over the world that can actually adapt and change. So I think as much as the building's adapting, I think the methodologies of how we will work will have an impact on these buildings. I feel, again, gifted by these clients and architects, because we probably have the best selection of buildings that can adapt fast and probably will inform the norm in London. It will probably lead the way, because these clients are also global. So they have offices all over the world, and we will learn from what they might be doing in other places, bring it back to London and see whether we can adjust to those things if our climate allows it, and make it much more possible to adapt them. So the biggest thing, Peter, is really adapting the knowledge, not necessarily the buildings.
But don't you think that buildings need to adapt? I mean, I would suggest that some of this goes back to even Alec Gordon and the whole idea of long life, loose fit, low energy. And a lot of us have been thinking about that for many years, but it's been difficult to make it happen. But as we look to a period when we need to have a more circular economy, what more do we do to maybe facilitate the ability of buildings to change and adapt to different uses?
No, I think absolutely. So I probably should have spelled it out. In baking in adaptability in these buildings, quite a lot of it is not new. We followed old things about floor to ceilings being higher, our windows open at the White Collar Factory. So these are not new things. And we've allowed for the future of a clean London. We've allowed for not worrying about noise, because cars will reduce. when we open windows. So there are things like that that are already baked in, and you're right, none of it is new. But the thing that is new and will happen faster, I hope, is that we put low-tech sensors in our building already. You know, we had them because we were trying to understand whether it's behaving the way we claim it behaves. We also are looking at technologies that we were already, wearable technologies that a comfort is actually monitored on you. So these kind of things are also not new. And I've been, you know, partly very fortunate in being involved in these kind of seminars at Harvard, where we're talking very quickly about the effects of healthy buildings and so on, and what will happen next. Buildings will need to change, you're right. But the ones we mentioned just now bake some of this in. What I think is that the stock of London has always been adaptable. If we look carefully, you know, when we look at rapid development, we've been even able to add 13, 14 stories onto existing towers that are 13, 14 stories. That's been done predominantly through investment in technology. So one thing is really understanding the materials and the atmosphere and the quality we want to create, and then trying to apply that to new systems, new ways of thinking about how you might build these buildings so they can mix use and they can change overnight and so on and so on. So I do think that the loose fit and natural light and air is not a new one. It's been around a long time, but the potential to getting there is getting closer now that we have the fantastic opportunity, which we would never have had because of this catastrophe. There is a moment where we can actually do the things very fast. We don't have to be slow burning about introducing some of these through specification, introducing through persuading clients. And the biggest shift that I hope will happen is construction cost, because that will encourage, if we can balance that out, that will encourage readaptation, and new buildings that get built will actually be built for a better value. So if we think about that aspect, I would personally feel that we have a new potential rather than a concern of re-looking at all of these buildings, even those that are 5 years old, then go back to 50-year-old ones. What I will say, Peter, is I'm skeptical about the hysteria, the balance that oscillates in terms of just taking all buildings and redoing them. In that, I think it oscillates between hysteria, skepticism. I sort of sit in the middle. You've got to take each building carefully, and our planners need to think about it very, very carefully, and then say, okay, what do we do? How can we actually adapt? And some sacred cows have already been broken in this. I think you probably know. We have Regent's Crescent, which was a classic crescent by John Nash, which a grade 1 listed building, which we have just completely redone by rebuilding the facade. We have Grosvenor Square, with David Chipperfield at one end, Eric Parry at the other end of the square, where we've redone these buildings that are not, one is new, the other one is adapting the old Sarinan building. And I think we've baked in again another 100-year potential in these buildings. So I do think you should cherry pick carefully and not just have a standard answer to say, let us just adapt all our buildings. You need the balance to create the richness that London has carefully.
Very good. Thank you for your response. So, Hanif, thank you very much for your insights. And I look forward to this period of huge change which we're about to face, and how you as a company will deal with that. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me. And I hope NLA continue in whatever shape you adapt yourself into. You're still new and you're still London as far as I'm concerned. But the A may need to be more than architects only somehow, because what you've proven in the last 15 years is the platform has been incredibly wonderful, because it's not biased towards one aspect or another. We're all allowed to have our say, and I think we enjoy that. So I do hope that NLA transform and help us all transform into that as well. Thanks for having me, Peter.
Thank you.